Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to J Raids and welcome to another Raid Shadow Legends video. On this week's arena topic, snapshot report, whatever you want to call it, we are going to be talking about the relics. Now, this is probably going to be one of the last-ish parts that we kind of need to cover. So we've talked about the blessings, we talked about the champions, and now we have a big part which is about the relics. And relics have honestly been a very interesting sort of extra additional customization that I think has been fairly awesome. That has been added in the past. When did relics get added? When did Chimera get added? Within the last year, maybe. I don't know. Someone tell me in the comments how long it's been since Chimera was released. Actually, it's probably been like 2 years. I don't know. Has it been that long? Anyways, I digress. But in today's video, I want to talk about how you guys can figure out what is the best relic for you guys to use for your champions in the arena for Raid Shadow Legends. So without further ado, let's dive into this week and let's talk about relics. So first thing is thinking about how you want to approach the topic of choosing the right relic. And I think that this can be broken down into 3 different parts, as there are 3 very important key components that go into making a relic. And that is the effect, the stats, as well as the gem slots. Now, the most important aspect about a relic, in my opinion, I think is the effect. And the way you want to think about this is, well, how does this effect synergize with the champion that I want to put it on, for example? Now, there are some relics that are going to be a lot more specific in their use case, and there are some more relics that are going to be more generic when it comes to what sort of effect. So you can think of Wand of Submission, for example. It is a generically strong effect that can be put on everybody. Similar with Volcardiac Heart, right? It's a generically strong relic that has a strong buff that you'd love to have across your team. But the second question is, okay, if the effect is not super synergistic and is not super focused on a specific champion, the second thing that you want to look at is the stats that the relic provides. And then, it can help you to build your champion a little bit better. So think of having a relic as additional banner, for example, right? Because the stats that it provides are going to be of a similar value. So if you see on Volcardiac Heart on the screen at level 18, it provides 96 resistance, and that's the same amount of resistance you would get from level 16 6-star banner, right? And so this, if the effect is not super important, the next thing you want to look at is the stats. So can your champion utilize these stats effectively in the form of basically having a second banner, for example? And then the last, but a very strong consideration, is to look at the gem slot. So do the gem shapes allocated for each relic fit the desired role of the champion that I want to put them on? And in the next slide, we'll kind of jump into the different gems and the somewhat correlations of what the shapes mean in terms of the roles. But at a very base level, these are the 3 things that you want to consider. So when we go into thinking about gem slots, we have, again, 5 different gem types. We have the circle, the triangle, the square, the diamond, and the pentagon. And these gems have a somewhat narrow or well-defined area that they do want to provide effectiveness for. For example, triangle gems are almost inherently damage focused, a very sort of aggressive slanted gem that you'd want to have more of on a damage dealing relic, for example. A square gem, for the most part, square gems are focused on damage mitigation. So they are gem types that you would like to have on a relic that goes on a tankier champion, for example. I think the other ones are a little bit less narrowly defined. Circle, for example, is probably the most flexible gem type, where it can have some of the best damage dealing gems, but also some of the best tankiness and also support gems as well. So circle is almost a universally good shape of gem that you'd like to have on pretty much everybody. But something like diamond and pentagon are a little bit more focused on either accuracy increasing effects or additional support effects / turn meter effects. So let's just quickly combine these two concepts together to build an understanding of how we want to think about relics. And then we'll dive into a little bit deeper into some of the tier lists that I've pointed out that I will divide into our different roles for the arena. So let's just jump into my champion log here, and I'm going to focus on some of my arena champions and just talk through the idea of why these relics are good on them. So on my Star Sage Galathir, this is, my tanky support reviver champion. I have a Volcardia cart on Galathir. And this works in two ways. I actually put Volcardia cart onto Galathir before I had a good Mercurial set. So I was building Galathir in a very high resistance build. And of course, Volcardia cart is one of the few relics in the game that actually gives resistance as one of the main stats. So at level 15, my Volcardia cart is of course giving me 74 resistance, which isn't the same level as a banner per se, but it is a good chunk of resistance in order to make sure that you can hit the resistance levels, the resistance benchmarks, or whatever you want to call it, in order to be able to resist things in the arena. And so for me, of course, the stats made perfect sense for the build I was going to go. And of course, the effect itself is also something that is generically nice to have across your team. It makes sense to build on supports because, generally speaking, you are able to stack a high amount of HP on your supports. And the magma shield amount that Volcardia cart grants is also based on the amount of total HP. So at level 15, the shield strength is equal to 18% of the target's max HP. And I'll just quickly just flash what my, I deleted it. But anyways, I had a resistance build previously. I think I had like 100 odd thousand health and about like 800 resistance, right? And so the Volcardia card on top of that would help me to not only make my Star Sage Galathir have more resistance and be tankier, but also to provide my team with a nice shield buff, right? Now I have swapped him into a Mercurial set, and I think that, Volcardia card is less good now, but I've committed a lot of Starstone to put it on here, as you can see with my gem selection here. But again, right, when we think about Volcardia card in the gem slots, it has 2 square gems and 2 circle gems. The circle gems, again, you can think as fairly flexible. In this case, I do have the mythical gem that ignores defense effects, or that makes ignore defense effects less effective against the wearer. So of course, it's just a nice gem to have as a tank. And again, square gems are mostly tank / damage mitigation. So for example, if the incoming damage here exceeds 30% of my max HP, it decreases the amount of damage received, right? So it's just like a damage mitigation effect. So I think this is a fairly easy example, right? Where the effect, the relic effect, synergizes with the champion, the stats benefit the champion, and the gem slots, well, are consistently coherent with what we're trying to achieve. Now, this isn't the case for my Rhodos right now, but I'll just give out another example where, if I can find, where are my, did I just miss it? Do I not have, there. Aspect of Siroth, right? So if you think about Rhodos as a champion, in the past, you might have put an aspect of Siroth on Rhodos. And if you look at the stats that aspect of Siroth gives, it gives defense, resistance, and accuracy, which if you think about Rhodos, he pretty much doesn't need any of those stats. And, accuracy can be okay if you want to land a decreased defense. But generally speaking, Rhodos is looking for, attack, health, crit damage, right? When it comes to the stats of aspect of Siroth, Rhodos generally wouldn't have any use for it. But because of how powerful the effect of aspect of Siroth synergized with Rhodos, it was a very sort of clear put decision where, hey, even though I'm not getting the right stats out of it, which is a pretty significant deal if you think about the amount of stats a relic actually brings, the effect of it is so strong and so synergistic with the champion, it's worth sacrificing the stats in order to make my champion stronger because of how powerful the effect is. Now, sorry that my face is blocking it, but you do notice that aspect of Siroth has 2 circle gems, which all in all is pretty good, and a square gem, but it doesn't have triangle gems, right? Which is the main one you're looking for when you're thinking about damage dealers. So even though the gem slots and the stats for aspect of Siroth aren't really relevant, the effect of it was so strong on Rhodos that most people opted to use it anyways. And so that's one instance, right? Where one, we have the Star Sage Galathir, everything lines up, everything checks out, easy decision, right? But for aspect of Seroth, we're thinking of, okay, the effect is super powerful, stats, gems, kind of whatever, but it's still the best option. And I think there's a little bit of another one where, yes, the effect is kind of minuscule, but the stats that the relic provides are just phenomenal, right? And that's something like Hollowed Hilt, where the effect is kind of hard to achieve. You need to have an active skill that has some level of heal in order to get the fervor buff. What is so good about Hollowed Hilt is it gives speed as the main stat, which there are only very few relics in the game that do that. But of course, speed is a super important stat on things like your lockout champions are to make sure that they go first. That even though my Crixia can't make use of the effect of Hollowed Hilt because of the stat stick that Hollowed Hilt provides, it is phenomenal. And of course, the gems do line up as well. We have 2 circle gems, which are good for providing additional resistance here. And we have 2 diamond gems, which also increase my total amount of resistance. So I think there's a few different ways to think about it, right? We had the example with Star Sage Galathir, where everything just kind of tick, tick, tick. You can like check them off the checklist. Everything makes sense. The effect makes sense. The stats make sense. The gem slots make sense. In the case of Rhodos, if you're thinking about with a aspect of Seroth, like in days past, you're like, okay, well, the stats aren't great. The gem slots are okay-ish, but the effect, right? That's like a double gold star. So okay, that also works out. And then finally, for something like Hollowed Hilt, where you're like, and the effect, I can't activate it consistently, and it kind of does whatever, really, in the most cases, but the stats are insane. The gem slots are fine, they're usable, flexible. I want to use it regardless of not being able to activate the effect, right? So that is the 3 ways that I like to think about the relics. And that kind of goes into our discussion of, okay, how do I approach the topic of choosing the right relic? Do I need all 3? Certainly not. It'd be nice if all of 3 conditions and criteria were aligned, but ultimately the most important is the effect. And if the effect of the relic is relatively generic, then the stats is really what kind of comes in and kicks in. And then the final consideration is the gems. So let's talk about a little bit about the right relics for the right roles. And the first one that I'm going to talk about here is I've broken these roles down similarly into how I talked about them in my gearing video. But I'll first start with the lockout champions. And these are, your Crixias, your Fabians, your Umekos, your whatever. And right now, I think the best relics in the game are any of the relics that have speed as the main stat. Of course, it's things like Hollowed Hilt, for example, the classic one that most people know and maybe even have. But any of the other ones, things like Crystallid, things like the Tower Helm, Crown of Corruption, even Lens of Intangibility, all of these give flat speed as the first main stat. And this is really, really important right now because most of the time your lockout champions are going to be the ones that go first in your group. Now, of course, I think it would actually be a very, very big shame if you had to use something like Chrysalid of Rebirth or Crown of Corruption or Lens of Intangibility, because I think those relics are just so much better on other roles instead of just being used for its pure speed for a lockout champion. So I think there's some consideration there if, maybe you have only one speed relic, but it's a Chrysalid of Rebirth and you'd love to have that on Reviver, for example, right? That's this one over here. And so maybe you're okay with sacrificing the best speed relic that you have onto a different champion where the effect of it and the stats synergize with the champion. I want to put it on instead of just using it for the stats. And that's where some of the lower tier options come in, which are still fantastic options, but now these don't have speed as the main stat. And you have things like Stars to the Jinang, or you have this is the Temporal Stagnator or the Mind of Marquette. And I think these 3 are very good in what they do. So Temporal Stagnator, I think, is the obvious one, where it gives both accuracy as a main stat and then as speed as a secondary stat. But it's very good with this lockout effect because it has a chance of applying the lockout effect on a weak hit. So this is something that's very good on Fabian, right? If you're going against Magic Affinity champions, even if you weak hit, you have that chance of still landing the lockout effect. It's kind of like how Lightning Cage is the Stone Skin, as Temporal Stagnator is the lockout effects, if you want to think about like that. Of course, it doesn't have speed as the main stat, but the stats across the board line up very well. And the other one, unfortunately, that I don't have is, Stars of the Jinnan, which is one of the relics from the Turtles event, which, sorry, that's the wrong one, which gives turn meter each time an enemy turn meter is increased. So it is like supersonic set, but on steroids. And it gives res HP accuracy, which is fantastic for someone like Crixia, for example, where Crixia can convert that resistance to accuracy, and that's super good. Now, if you didn't have Crixia, but you did have Stars of Jinang, you could put this on Fabian still because of how powerful the effect was in order to cut in terms of enemy speed boosters. If your enemy used the speed boost effect, this relic would likely to help your lockout champion cut it into the turns. And even though it gives resistance main stat, which something like Fabian doesn't actually use, the effect of it is so powerful where it kind of fits the bill, right? And so again, that's how you kind of want to think about these relics. It's like, okay, well, how powerful is the effect versus the stats that it gives? And if it is worth the trade-off, then okay, I think it's the right choice. Now, beforehand, before the whole meta change, I would say Stars of Jinnan used to be the best relic in the game for lockout champions. But now that's a little bit different, where lockout champions are going first instead of going second or cutting in past a speed booster, right? And so because now there are less speed boosters going before lockout champions, there's a little bit of a less value to it, where maybe you don't even get the effect at all before you get to go with your lockout champion. So of course, this is a little bit of a different story. And then Temporal Stagnator, Mind of Marquette. I think these are both. I think Mind of Marquette also gives, speed and accuracy as the first two main stats. So from a stat perspective, they make sense. Mind of Marquette actually has a fairly interesting effect where you can place a fatigue debuff. And so if you do an AoE A3 with Fabian, you strip all the stone skins, you have the chance of landing fatigue debuff. That's actually fairly awesome. So the S tier relics have some level of semblancy in terms of how powerful their effects are and some alignment with the sort of stats that it brings. And then as you go down, of course, you have Wand, generically powerful. Relic, fantastic sort of distribution of stats, or has HP, speed, accuracy. So most lockout champions benefit from it. Also prevents lockout champions from getting CC'd before they place a lockout. So again, Wand, very generically good across the board, has a nice stat distribution where every stat can be utilized by lockout champions, but doesn't bring anything incredible to the table, right? And then finally, some other options down there. I try not to touch too much on these, but once you have, once you go down all the way to the bottom of the list, now it's like, okay, I don't have relics on the top, which give me good distribution stats, which have decently powerful benefits. And now you're just thinking about stat sticks in general. And so you have things like, gosh, I don't know, things like, where'd it go? Where's the mask? Like Mask of Disquiet gives resistance, gives speed. That's like okay-ish again on a Crixia, right? But the effect itself doesn't really benefit the champion. Gems I think are okay. Or you have something like Hand of Creation, right? You have accuracy, resistance, speed. Generally speaking, quite good stats across the board for lockout champions, but the effect itself is super negligible and doesn't really impact, right? So for lockout champions, speed is king. If you have additional relics that are speed stat main first, I think those are going to be your best first option for lockout champions. In this case, the best one is either the Tower Helm, or is it Torture Helm? What's it called? You have the best case in my mind is the Tower Helm, which is better than Hilt, because most cases lockout champions can't actually benefit from the fervor buff from healing allies with the Hilt. Our Helm just gives a free fortify buff and extra tankiness to your lockout champion. That is, it's just a pure plus. And when it comes to gems, sorry, can't see in the bottom left here, but we have a square gem, 2 diamonds, and a circle, which are, good. Then Hilt would be next because again, it's kind of a shame to have to use something like Chrysalis of Rebirth or Lens of Intangibility or Crown of Corruption. 3 very fantastic relics because I'll just try to point them out. Crown of Corruption, we have Lens of Intangibility as well as Chrysalis of Rebirth. Now, of course, these are super, super rare. 1 and 2, it's kind of a shame to have to put these on lockout champions when they can't benefit from the incredibly powerful effect, or these effects are so insanely powerful compared to something like a hollowed hilt, where it's such a shame to have to use them just as the stat stick, because lockout champions can't revive anybody, right? Unless maybe there's someone I didn't think of. But again, speed as the main stat is the top priority. After that, we have some very powerful relic effects such as Temporal Stagnator, Stars of Jinan, Mind of Marquette, and these all have, again, gem slots and stats that do align with your lockout champions. Now, of course, there are a huge plethora of other relics that either give accuracy as the main stat or have very niche sort of effects that I'm just simply not going to cover because there's like 100 relics in the game and I'm not going to go through all of them. But again, I just want to try to give you guys the framework of how to think about what relics to put on your champions. And in the most case, it's going to be effect first, stats second. Now, let's talk about revivers in the game. And this is mostly looking at, your people you clad in 9-piece Mercurial, right? And again, at the top, I think are the relics, the SS tiers, the tier that I kind of want to call out as the if you have these relics, you're kind of just winning at the game. And for me, these 3 relics for the reviver role are 1, Chrysalis of Rebirth, 2, Stars of Jinan, and the third one's slightly questionable, but I have seen it being used, and that's the Zibia's Servitude. So starting with Chrysalis of Rebirth, I think there's no introduction here on why it is the best, as long as you know what the relic does. It is impossibly rare, coming only from mythical clan v clan fragments, which can only be obtained in a tier 8 siege. But it's so insane at what it does. Not only are the stats incredible, giving speed again as the main stat, but this effect, being able to grant an extra turn after reviving allies, which actually I think upgrades up to 100%, is so powerful. Like, you can revive your team and then you get an extra turn. Maybe you heal your team. Maybe you put out a CC effect, right? Chrysalis of Rebirth is just so insane in terms of being for a reviver. It fits everything across the board. It check, triple check mark, triple golden star. If you have it, you are super lucky because, wow, it's impossibly hard to get, right? Now, Stars of the Jinan, I think, is a very interesting call out to me, because you normally wouldn't think of putting it on a reviver, because I think most people hardwired to think, okay, it's kind of like a supersonic set, and supersonic really benefits for like lockout champions, and revivers, even if they cut in, they don't always have the highest benefit. But with the introduction of Mercurial, it just makes so much sense for Stars of Jinan to benefit Mercurial revivers, because of it is by far the relic that provides the most turn meter in the game. I don't even think many relics even provide turn meter. I think there's a few interesting ones, like Exuzar's Totem, for example. But when it comes to pure turn meter, I think there's nothing in the game that beats Stars Jinan. And at least it gives resistance as a first stat, which can be useful if you are trying to build resistance on your revivers. So because of how powerful Mercurial is, and because it also does give resistance, I think it is also in the tier of SS as one of the best relics in the game to use for your revivers. I think the third one's a little bit more of a toss-up with Zibia's Servitude. Stat-wise, I think it's very nice, giving plenty of defensive stats as well as some speed third stat. But I think the effect is relatively shaky. Now, you guys know of it as a very good and annoying relic on champion like Nice the Shadow Thief, which can make him very difficult to kill. But the thing with Nice the Shadow Thief versus other revivers is, well, one, Nice the Shadow Thief is a HP champion, has a high base HP, and can be built with a lot of HP. And then he gains more HP on top of that with his passive, right? So if Nice Shadow Thief is walking around with 200k HP and you can't crit on him when he's under 35% HP, you know, he has a 70k health buffer where he can't get crit on. Now, most revivers otherwise have much lower HP. If you look at my Star Sage Galathir, for example, he only has very short of 100k HP, right? So you can't be crit under 35k health, which is kind of low. Like, that's not a lot of buffer space. Even if you built your reviver with, you know, max HP and all the other stats, maybe you're reaching 120k health, but I think it's very difficult to really go past that number, which really doesn't give that much room for Zibia's Servitude to actually have a really strong use. But I have seen it on, you know, I have seen people use it on things like their Theodosia, and it can be very good at giving a sort of very similar effect to like Aspect of Seroth being able to survive a otherwise potentially lethal hit without having to spend your turn meter for it can be very good. Now you will have to, you know, really index into the health part of it in order to get yourself the highest sort of buffer window, but it can be very good. And in the S tier, again, I think speed relics are generally very powerful even for revivers, because the faster you are with your 9-piece Mercurial, the more turns you get to cycle through in order to upkeep your total guard stacks. So things like the Tower Helm as well as the Hilt are very good options, and revivers can actually utilize Hilt in some aspect because most of them have heals, right? So right now I have a hollowed hilt on my Sifi. It works well. She has a speed booster. She gains benefits from the speed, and she has an A1 that can heal. So she is actually able to activate the fervor buff on the hollowed hilt. If I was, you know, if I had unlimited Starstone and Starstone just like grew on trees, I would probably consider putting hollowed hilt on my Star Sage Galathir as well in order to give him that extra 18 speed. Or 24 speed if you're really balling. But for now, Volcardia Cart just works for me. The buff is fine. I do think it is going to be worse than Hollowed Hilt, especially in these cases, but it's still a solid use. Infernal Ice Polytope, I think, is another very interesting one where, again, it's a sort of rare mythical relic that I think comes from what? It comes from the Chimera. No, it doesn't come from Chimera. It comes from a tag team or live arena, where it fully resets the cooldowns of wearer skills whenever their HP drops below 15 up to 40%, and has a cooldown of 3 turns. It's actually quite interesting where it is a pseudo lockout protection. If you get locked out and then, you know, you take a bunch of damage, you get a full cooldown refresh. And the cooldown, you know, is only 3 turns, which means that if you get to that first cycle of abilities, you can do your revive, your heal, and then you have like your Mercurial, right? It's fairly reasonable in terms of, I think, cycling through your turns, getting to your effects, but it kind of falls in the same category as Zibia's Servitude, where if you're, you know, that low health to begin with, you have to, one, put on a really tanky champion that maybe has damage mitigation in their kit, such as a Star Sage Galathir. Otherwise, you're just gonna die if you drop down to that low health, right? And also doesn't give any speed, which actually does give speed. It gives speed as a second stat, but again, it's super rare, and I think that everything above it outclasses it. Maybe maybe I'd put it after Hilt, but I think it's fairly interesting, but probably a much smaller population of revivers can actually utilize it, because I think you need to have someone who has an additional passive that grants them a little bit more survivability on top of it. Now, as we go down the list, again, you'll notice the same common themes where the effects maybe aren't as good, the stats aren't as beneficial, things like Volcardia Cart. I think resistance in general is just a little bit less powerful right now because it's much harder to build high resistance with 9-piece Mercurial. So it kind of goes in that box. Wand, again, I think generically good, kind of always in the A tier level. Now, I think Soulmar Crystal is kind of an interesting one that came out with the Grim Forest. So once per turn, the wearer has a 50% chance of activating instant turn effect whenever one or more allies are killed, and it can be upgraded to 100%. Now, again, stat-wise, very excellent across the board. HP, speed, resistance, effect, okay-ish, honestly. It can be a little bit awkward if you're thinking about, you know, hey, you have a champion that does a full team revive, but only one champion dies, you pop your instant turn, and maybe it's not all that useful. Or maybe you're going to go next in the turn order anyways because you were the fastest champion. You went through your turn. Your enemy turn happened. They nuked your board and everyone died, and then you were going to go anyways. So I think the effect itself can be maybe good or bad depending on the exact specific situation, but I think it's still a good call out in terms of, hey, this is a brand new relic that came into the game, and honestly I think it has some fairly good and interesting applications. Now, as we go down the list, I think these are where the effects become a little bit weaker and the utility itself is, also a little bit worse. You have things like Aspect of Seroth, the Harp, the Oricoro, or the Ouroboros, whatever it is. Like I'll just quickly try to point them out. But you have things like the Oculus Custodian, which removes debuffs whenever you lose a certain amount of HP. You have things like, what else do we have here? We have, Aspect of Seroth. We have Golden Elixir. We have Demonic Effigy. We have Inferno Sphere, which is in the Clan v Clan, right? Inferno Sphere, which is one of the few like non-legendary and up relics that gives resistance main stat, for example. Have like the Golden Pinion. You have a lot of these generically like indecent like relics, or for Golden Pinion, right? That just provide some level of tankiness, some level of additional support or turn meter or whatever, and give fairly good stats. Honestly, there aren't really any bad choices here. It's just that the effects are just, I think, outshadowed and outclassed by some of the better relics that do exist in the game. And that's not to say that they're bad. Having a legendary relic that still gives 3 gem slots gives you a lot more power because the gems in themselves can be super, super powerful. And that's something we're not really going to cover in today's video, just the amount of extra additional effect that some of the gems give. But having the gem slots on the appropriate places can give a really big boost to your relics. Finally, let's talk a little bit about Nuker relics. And I think this is where things are definitely the most diverse in terms of how much power level is actually allocated, as well as some of the different effects that some of these relics provide. So again, I think in the SS tier, these are by far the best effects in the game for some of these relics. And we have Stormcaller, Death Dealer, Lens of Intangibility, and what is it? Coronet of Doom or something like that. Yeah, Coronet of Gloom. So I'm going to start with Stormcaller, which I think is, if I had to say what the best relic in the game is right now, especially for Nukers, I think this is probably in that conversation. It is so fantastic on Marius, and it basically just places additional stuns based on how many crits you deal. Of course, most of these are damage dealing relics, and they are very heavily leaning towards having the right stats for damage dealers. So it's really easy to kind of look across the board. Hey, most of these relics have triangle and circle gems. Most of these provide attack crit damage in some capacity, and most of them have very powerful effects, right? So that's one of the easy parts when it comes to thinking about damage dealing relics. But Stormcaller is an easy one for that because it is so powerful right now against what is it called, against Mercurial, because it just is able to play stuns. You're able to strip off Mercurial relatively easy, especially with someone like a Marius, and then you can place like an AoE stun that doesn't need any accuracy to land. And it can be very, very strong, even not on Marius, for example, because, well, one, in the past, maybe you had Stone Skin, maybe you had Feral sets or whatnot. But now Mercurial, I think, is a little bit easier to bypass as long as you can get through those stacks. And if you are able to just dish out stun after stun, it can become very, very annoying for your opponent to deal with. Of course, 2 triangle, 2 circle gems, fantastic stats. I think it's an easy winner. Death Dealer is the second interesting one. This is the live arena mythical attack dealing, or the attack relic. And this one is super interesting because I think this one has the most unique effect out of any relic in the game, where Wearer's attacks will always be critical, and then you'll just take more damage, like double damage, for example. And this is super good on champions that are not void affinity, so they can prevent weak hits. It also bypasses things like Bayek passive, so it can always crit even if there is someone like the Bayek passive on the field. So that can be something that catches people off guard. but it's so good at ensuring critical debuffs land, right? So if you think of someone like a Carnage, for example, being able to consistently land that block passive and block active buffs against any Magic Affinity champion like Nice the Shadow Thief, it is so important to get that consistency, even though it doesn't do anything like super flashy. It is also good against, weak affinity damage dealers. So right now in the meta, there are a lot of force affinity champions. If you think like Theodosia, Predator, Embrius, things like that. If you want to bring in any sort of magic affinity damage dealer, they're going to have a little bit of a tough time. And this can really swing the deal if you put this on Rotos, for example, right? You're able to just kill anything and you basically avoid affinity champion at that point. Now, the other two are the mythical relics from the Grim Forest, and these are just super insane. Lens of Intangibility is the best relic in the game for ignore defense, and Coronet of Gloom also has a very interesting survival mechanic that can help your damage dealers give a little bit more of survivability without having to sacrifice on the damage dealing stats. As you go down, I think the sort of the gold standard here, I think, is the Cat's Gaze. It is by far the best legendary relic in the game, at least for damage dealers. And it's kind of like the golden standard, right? It's just a flat percent ignore damage or ignore defense while providing good stats. So there's really not much to mention there. You guys kind of know how good it is. And then as you go down the board, you have things like the Crown of Corruption, you have the Covetous's Passion, Diabolical Dice, the Last Laugh Amulet. And these are all leaning towards that, damage dealer kit. But these don't have ignored defense anymore, except for Covetous's Passion. But these only increase the amount of damage and has some extra utility as well. But from a pure damage dealing perspective, they just do a little bit less for the wearer because they don't ignore extra defense, which is one of the strongest sort of effects for nukers, especially things like Crown of Corruption. Yes, it gives speed main set, but it only boosts damage, right? So a little bit of a different pool of users for it, but still very strong. And I think I want to call out Last Laugh Amulet because I think it's actually really, really awesome what it does. Its stats, I think, are a little bit less good in terms of for damage dealers, but it has a very interesting effect where it can activate a delay effect on your target or on the wearer, which can help it survive if you have other champions that go in. It's kind of unique in that sense. It's kind of like Aspect of Seroth, but one, it doesn't decrease turn meter, and two, it actually provides offensive stats. So it can be very good for champions that either are in Mercurial or have protected passives that grant them additional protective stats like block damage or something like that, right? If you think of someone like an Odin, it's kind of like an upgrade to Aspect of Seroth while giving offensive stats. And again, as you go down the list, you have Essence Quencher, Gore Crescent, Thunder Spear, and as you go down, right, you have a little bit less powerful effects. Still good gem slots, still good stats, but again, the effects as you go down the list are just not as prevalent. And I think situationally, you have things like Sibia's Servitude, which is really good on very, very, very high HP nukers and pretty much only nice. You have Wand of Submission, which is still good on champions that maybe you just want a little bit more utility on, which already have enough damage that you don't need a supplement. And you have things like the Spore Cast Wand or something like that, whatever it's called. You have the Spore Burst Rod and Arachno Elixir that are just more situational for poison and bomb champions. And now, before we end off this week's topic, I have one more champion highlight I want to throw in for you guys here. And this is a champion that I think I've been super impressed by. I don't see it much, and that's why I kind of want to give a little bit of a shout out. And that is Grand Oak Paldrig of the Sylvan Watchers. Let's pull it up real quick, because honestly, I don't really see much of him. I think he's definitely been classed as more of a PvE champion. But I think his kit is actually very, very powerful in terms of today's meta. So of course, one, he gives that speed relic or speed ore doesn't work for arena, so never mind that. But to kick things off, he has a really cool passive where at the start of this champion's turn, he places a buff on all allies that depend on their type. And so this will usually be a very, very beneficial buff across the board for anyone that gets it. Team-wide buff gives increased attack for attack-based champions, increased defense for defense champions, increased accuracy for support champions, and then a shield buff for ally or for HP based champions. So just very, very powerful passive across the board that has a 1-turn cooldown, but is able to keep continuous uptime. That's not even the best part of his kit. He has a fairly good sort of turn meter boost effect. It's 20%, not the biggest, but it is a full cleanse as well as a 30% increased speed on all allies. So relatively strong turn meter boost effect if you are trying to vie for that go first spot. But I think the big part of it is that he is a speed booster that also has an ally attack buff or ally attack skill. And he can team up with all allies to attack a single enemy. And then allies of course joins their default skills. But one big thing that I didn't realize about this champion, on top of him having an ally attack ability, is that this also fully restores all targets destroyed max HP, all of it. That is phenomenal right now because of all of the life harvest blessings running around, or just whatever other ways of there is for destroying max HP. And this is a very super rare effect. I only know of 2 other champions that do it, and that is Marichka as well as Gallius, right? I can't think of any other champion, at least that are good arena meta champions, that have this ability to restore damage or destroyed max HP. Of course, an ally attack is really good right now as well because it is very effective against Mercurial, being able to punch through that Mercurial. Much more effective against Mercurial than something like Stone Skin, right? And then finally on his A1, he just has a random chance of, this is 50% chance of decreasing the cooldown of a random ally's active skill by 2 turns. So if you just flip a random coin and it lands on the correct way or on the correct target after a lockout ability, you have like a pseudo refresh just kind of all in one. And of course you can pair this with things like counterattack masteries and such. So I think he's a super solid champion. I've seen like 1 person in the arena running him around, and I think he's fantastic. Super strong, super awesome effect, super synergistic with or against a lot of the meta right now. And I do want to call him out because I think he is an awesome champion. So I think that concludes the meta report for this week. We wanted to cover relics and thinking about helping you guys think about how you guys can utilize relics on your account for the champions that you guys want. We had introduced a framework. We're thinking about the effect of the relic, then the stats, and then the gem considerations. And I hope this gives you a little additional direction in deciding what the best relic for your champions are, instead of just blindly following like a tier list because, oh, these relics are just good. So hope you guys enjoyed this week's arena meta snapshot report video. If you guys liked the video, please give a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. And let me know what you guys think about this week's topic. Without further ado, I'll leave it there, and I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. Peace out, guys. Take care.